In the intricate web of global affairs and national security, the Trump administration's recent maneuvers reveal a multifaceted strategy aimed at reasserting American dominance on the world stage while fortifying domestic borders. As December 2025 unfolds, three pivotal developments stand out. A high-stakes White House convening focused on Venezuela's escalating crisis, diplomatic overtures toward resolving the protracted Ukraine-Russia conflict, and an intensified domestic push to overhaul immigration enforcement. These initiatives, interwoven with economic imperatives, military posturing, and public sentiment, underscore a broader vision of America First that prioritizes decisive action over prolonged entanglements. This analysis delves into the nuances of each, exploring their interconnections, potential ramifications, and the delicate balance between aggression and pragmatism that defines the administration's approach. At the heart of this narrative is the administration's unyielding focus on Venezuela, where a scheduled Oval Office summit signals a potential turning point in a decades-long saga of sanctions, proxy confrontations, and humanitarian fallout. Set for 5 p.m. Eastern Time in the Oval Office, this gathering brings together key figures including National Security Advisor Dan Kane, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, White House Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, and Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller. Their agenda, charting next steps amid a ramped-up pressure campaign that has already seen U.S. naval assets, including the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, positioned in the Caribbean Sea. This military buildup, comprising over 15,000 personnel and advanced surveillance capabilities, is ostensibly targeted at disrupting narco-trafficking networks funneling cocaine and fentanyl precursors northward. Yet, beneath the surface, it serves as a geopolitical lever against President Nicolás Maduro's regime, which Washington has branded as state sponsor of terrorism. The Venezuela strategy emerges not in isolation, but as a response to intertwined threats. Over the past month, U.S. forces have executed precision strikes on suspected drug-laden vessels off Venezuela's coast, with one operation reportedly neutralizing a high-value target. After an initial engagement left survivors, these actions, justified under counter-narcotics authorities, have ignited fierce debate over their legality. Critics argue they skirt international norms on the laws of armed conflict, potentially constituting unauthorized uses of force absent a congressional declaration of war. Maduro's government, in turn, has decried them as colonialist aggressions, vowing retaliation while rallying domestic support through defiant rhetoric. Just days ago, President Trump confirmed a private phone conversation with Maduro, though details remain shrouded. Sources suggest the call probed openings for dialogue, with Maduro's intermediaries signaling willingness to negotiate amid economic strangulation from U.S. sanctions that have halved Venezuela's oil exports. This diplomatic flicker contrasts sharply with Trump's public broadsides, including a weekend social media directive, effectively declaring Venezuelan airspace off-limits to commercial and illicit flights alike, backed by Federal Aviation Administration advisories citing hazardous conditions. The order has grounded dozens of regional carriers, stranding passengers and crippling Maduro's revenue streams from air travel. Economically, it's a masterstroke. Venezuela's aviation sector, already battered by hyperinflation, loses millions weekly, forcing the regime to divert scarce resources from military hardening to civilian logistics. But the risks are palpable. Analysts warn that such isolation could accelerate refugee outflows. Over 7 million Venezuelans have fled since 2014, with spikes correlating to U.S. policy shifts straining neighbors like Colombia and Brazil, and indirectly bolstering the very migration pressures Trump seeks to curb at home. Shifting continents, the Ukraine talks represent a counterpoint of calculated restraint, where the administration leverages negotiation as a tool to extricate the U.S. from Europe's quagmire, without ceding ground to adversaries. Following a productive session in Hallandale Beach, Florida, involving Rubio, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner with Ukrainian National Security Council head Rustem Umerov, momentum builds toward a comprehensive settlement. Trump has publicly touted good progress, emphasizing a framework that eschews mere ceasefires for a durable peace, preserving Ukraine's sovereignty while addressing Russian security concerns. Witkoff's imminent Moscow visit, potentially including a sit-down with Vladimir Putin, builds on an August Alaska summit, where preliminary accords outlined territorial integrity guarantees and phased sanctions relief. The Florida dialogue, described by Rubio as yielding tangible advancements, refined a 28-point U.S. proposal initially criticized for tilting toward Moscow. Amendments now incorporate European input, including NATO-backed security pacts for Kyiv and economic reconstruction incentives tied to demilitarization zones. Ukraine battered by relentless Russian barrages, including a November 30th missile strike on a Kyiv suburb that claimed civilian lives, enters these talks from a position of resilience, bolstered by U.S. arms deliveries that have stalled Russian advances in Donbas. Yet, former intelligence officials caution that Putin views negotiations as a stalling tactic, using them to consolidate gains and erode Western unity. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has echoed this, insisting any deal honor the spirit of prior Trump-Putin understandings, while issuing veiled threats of escalation if Ukraine doesn't withdraw from annexed regions. For the Trump administration, success here could redefine its foreign policy legacy. A swift resolution would free up billions in aid, over $175 billion committed since 2022 for domestic priorities, while burnishing Trump's image as a dealmaker who ends wars his predecessors prolonged. Europe, however, frets over the pace. NATO allies convening in Brussels without Rubio's presence fear a premature accord that emboldens Moscow elsewhere, from the Baltics to the Black Sea. Domestically, the talks poll well among Trump's base, who prioritize isolationism, but risk backlash if perceived as capitulation. Zelensky's team, meanwhile, pushes for ironclad U.S. commitments, including long-range missile access, to deter future incursions, a demand Trump has sidestepped, favoring economic levers like post-war investment in Ukrainian agriculture to bind Kyiv westward. These international gambits do not exist in a vacuum. They collide with the administration's domestic immigration overhaul, a sweeping crackdown catalyzed by tragedy and executed with bureaucratic precision. The November 27th shooting of two National Guard members Sarah Beckstrom, 20, and Andrew Wolf, 24, outside Washington, D.C., by Afghan National Rahman Nullah Lakenwal, has supercharged rhetoric and policy alike. Lakenwal granted asylum in April 2025 after fleeing Taliban reprisals, allegedly harbored radicalized grievances, prompting Trump to declare an indefinite pause on all asylum adjudications. This freeze, affecting thousands of pending cases, extends to a full audit of green cards and refugee statuses issued under prior administrations, targeting holders from 19 high-risk nations including Afghanistan, Venezuela, Haiti, and Somalia. The policy's architecture is both broad and surgical. U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services (USCIS) Director Joseph Adlow's memo mandates negative factors in reviews, such as inadequate home country identity verification or ties to unstable regimes, potentially revoking protections for up to 233 individuals admitted between 2021 and early 2025. Expedited removals, bypassing full hearings, now apply to a wider net, including those with temporary shielded status from Biden-era programs, like humanitarian parole for Venezuelans. Enforcement ramps up via reallocated federal agents, deputized local sheriffs, and National Guard deployments, aiming for 1 million deportations annually. Giant detention facilities, dubbed processing hubs, are slated for border states, capable of housing 50,000 pending expulsions, with private contractors handling logistics. Critics decry this as a humanitarian siege, arguing it ensnares families and economic contributors. Undocumented workers underpin 5% of U.S. GDP per labor studies, while ignoring root causes like Venezuela's collapse, which the administration's own sanctions exacerbate. Protests have flared in sanctuary cities, from Los Angeles to New York, with faith groups and businesses decrying labor shortages in agriculture and construction. Yet, public support surges. Polls show 62% approval for the crackdown, fueled by the DC incident and narratives linking migration to crime spikes. Trump's response honoring the victims at a White House ceremony humanizes the policy, framing it as protective rather than punitive. Interrogating the threads binding these stories reveals a cohesive, if contentious, doctrine. Venezuela's turmoil directly feeds U.S. immigration woes. Maduro's economic mismanagement, compounded by sanctions, has displaced millions, with Venezuelans comprising 25% of southern border encounters in 2025. The administration's Caribbean naval cordon, while anti-drug and veneer, doubles as a migration deterrent, funneling asylum seekers into perilous sea routes patrolled by Coast Guard cutters. Similarly, Ukraine's stability indirectly bolsters U.S. border security. A resolved war could redirect European resources to refugee absorption, easing transatlantic flows that strain American intake. Trump's envoy Witkoff, juggling Middle East and Ukraine dockets, embodies this linkage. His Moscow push might yield Russian concessions on energy exports, stabilizing global oil prices and undercutting Maduro's petro-barter with Tehran. Economically, the triad amplifies leverage. Venezuela's airspace shutdown throttles $200 million in annual remittances from U.S. expatriates, pressuring Maduro's elite while signaling to migrants, return is no refuge. In Ukraine, a peace dividend could unlock $500 billion in frozen Russian assets for reparations, funding U.S.-led infrastructure in KYV, and reducing aid burdens. Domestically, the immigration purge targets anchor babies and chain migration, projecting $1.5 trillion in long-term savings per fiscal analyses, though offset by enforcement costs exceeding $20 billion yearly. Politically, it's electoral gold. Base voters, weary of endless wars and open borders, reward boldness, with midterms looming. Yet, perils lurk. In Venezuela, miscalculation risks quagmire. Regime change without a viable successor could spawn ISIS-like chaos, exporting terror and drugs anew. Legal headwinds mount. Lawsuits challenge vessel strikes as extrajudicial killings, invoking Geneva Conventions, while asylum pauses face injunctions from federal courts citing due process. Ukraine's talks teeter on trust deficits. Putin's history of bad faith pacts from Minsk to Istanbul suggests any deal might fracture under first provocation. Immigration's human toll, family separations, mental health crises could erode suburban support, alienating moderates who backed Trump's economic populism. Broader implications ripple globally. Allies like the UK and Canada, co-sponsors in Ukraine, grapple with U.S. unilateralism, straining Five Eyes intelligence sharing. In Latin America, Brazil's Lula da Silva condemns the Venezuela blockade as imperial overreach, potentially isolating Washington at OAS summits. Domestically, the crackdown intersects culture wars. Evangelical leaders praise border piety, while Latino evangelicals, 20% of the bloc, decry moral hypocrisy. Environmentally, naval ops in the Caribbean threaten coral ecosystems, drawing Greenpeace ire amid climate pledges. Looking ahead, the Oval Office meeting could pivot Venezuela toward de-escalation. A Maduro exile for sanctions lift toward brinkmanship, with land incursions floated by hawks like Miller. Ukraine's Moscow rendezvous, if fruitful, might yield a Trump accord by year's end, blending neutrality zones with U.S. energy deals. Immigration's audit, rolling out in phases, tests institutional resilience. Early revocations could hit 50,000 by spring, reshaping demographics. Ultimately, this constellation of policies embodies Trump's ethos: confront threats head-on, negotiate from strength, and insulate the homeland. Success hinges on execution, blending coercion with concessions lest overreach invite the very instabilities it aims to preempt. As 2025 wanes, these threads weave a tapestry of ambition and apprehension, where America's resurgence demands not just power, but wisdom.